Reborn, I didn't take that arrow for him. Last life. I saved him. He swore forever. Then married my stepsister. Play the full story in one go. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. The exciting story begins right now. The wind within the hunting grounds carried a bone-chilling cold, and the sound of hoofs thundered across the earth like drumbeats. I pulled tight on the reins, my fingertips turning white from the strain. At my side, Gu Tingyuan's jet-black riding attire looked particularly dashing in the afterglow of the setting sun. He had turned his head slightly, his gaze wandering deep into the dense forest, clearly searching for prey. "Yaoer, stay close to me," he whispered, his tone carrying his usual air of authority and finality. I lowered my gaze slightly to hide the piercing chill in my eyes, and simply replied softly, "Yes, Your Highness." In a past life, it was at this very moment that a cold arrow, laced with a deadly poison, would pierce the air and fly toward him. To save him, I would spur my horse to block the arrow at his side, and the arrow would pierce my shoulder blade, the excruciating pain nearly causing me to fall from the horse. And what promise did he make to me then? He clasped my pale hand, his eyes filled with anguish and deep affection. "Yaoer, I will marry no one but you in this life, and I vow to protect you for the rest of your days." Yet in the blink of an eye, it was he who was constantly coming and going from the Helan Manor to care for his frightened stepsister, Helan Yen, and it was also he who pleaded with the emperor to take Helan Yen as a concubine, even going so far as to cast me aside like a worn-out shoe. The metallic taste of blood from the excruciating pain still seemed to be churning in the back of my throat. And now, it was all happening again. Whoosh, a piercing sound suddenly rang out, the sharp whiz of an arrow tearing through the air. I could clearly sense that fierce, murderous intent heading straight for the small of Gu Tingyuan's back. Following the course of my previous life, I should have spurred my horse to charge across at that very moment, using my frail, flesh and blood body to block that fatal blow for him. Gu Tingyuan clearly sensed the danger as well. His body froze suddenly, and he instinctively tried to turn and block the arrow, but the distance was simply too close. The arrow shot through the air like a bamboo spear, carrying a chilling aura of death. He gave me a pleading look, a gaze filled with utter trust and conviction, as if he were absolutely certain I would risk my life for him. I watched him, but at the very last moment, I yanked hard on the reins. My steed, startled by the pain, sidestepped half a step in the opposite direction. And just like that, in full view of everyone, I evaded his flank, leaving him completely exposed to those deadly arrows. Pfft! The sound of the blade cutting into the flesh was clear and dull. Gu Tingyuan's pupils suddenly contracted, before the look of disbelief could fade from his face. Excruciating pain caused him to tumble from his horse. "Your Highness!" A chorus of gasps rang out all around me, and the guards instantly fell into chaos, dismounting and rushing over. I watched it all with a cold gaze, not even hurrying to approach. I simply tightened the reins slowly, bringing my horse to a gradual stop a short distance away. Gu Tingyuan curled up in the grass, cold sweat instantly soaking through his clothes. The arrow hadn't struck his chest. Instead, it had veered a few inches off course and lodged itself in his left shoulder. He looked up at me, veins bulging at his temples, his eyes filled not only with pain but also with the shock of betrayal. "Lanyao, you." With a calm expression, I dismounted, moving as gracefully as if I were admiring flowers. Without the slightest trace of panic, I walked over to him, knelt halfway on the ground, but did not reach out to help him up. Instead, I lowered my gaze to the black blood seeping from his shoulder, my tone so flat it sent a chill down my spine. "How could your highness be so careless? This dense forest is teeming with snakes, insects, and a hail of arrows. You ought to remain vigilant at all times." He opened his mouth as if to say something, but was interrupted by a violent cough, and black, poisonous blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. I slowly rose to my feet and ordered the guards, who had long since frozen in place, "Hurry and report to His Majesty, send for the imperial physician, and while you're at it, seal off the area and hunt down the assassin." My voice was clear and icy, radiating an air of unquestionable authority. Gu Tingyuan stared at me intently, and that sense of control, once so familiar and arrogant, shattered in the depths of his eyes. He surely couldn't understand how Lanyao, who had once been willing to risk her very life for him, could have turned into a cold, empty shell in the blink of an eye. I turned around, my back to him. The sky over the hunting grounds was gradually darkening. The heavy clouds hung so low they seemed poised to swallow up the wilderness. I looked at the dense forest not far away. I didn't care how many conspiracies it harbored. All I knew was that, from this moment on, I would no longer be a stepping stone for him. Let this arrow serve as repayment for the blind devotion I showed in my past life. Inside the imperial physician's tent, the smell of medicine was so strong it was suffocating. I stood outside the tent, watching as Lanyao hurried over. Her hair was slightly disheveled at her temples. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her tear-filled eyes were brimming with anxiety and hurt. When she saw me, she paused in her tracks and, in an instant, her voice broke with tears. "Sister, the prince, how is he? I heard something terrible has happened, my heart is breaking." I watched her behavior with a cold gaze. In my past life, she was exactly like this, always portraying herself as Gu Tingyuan's confidant. When I was gravely wounded after shielding him from an arrow, she entered the mansion under the pretense of caring for me, only to whisper sweet nothings in Gu Tingyuan's ear, turning my unwavering loyalty into a pitiful joke. I stepped aside to avoid her insincere offer to help me up and said coldly, "The prince's arrow wound has penetrated to the bone, and the poison has not yet been neutralized. The imperial physician is currently performing acupuncture. If you go in, please do not disturb him." Lanyao paused for a moment, clearly not expecting me to be less attentive to her than usual. She bit her lower lip, a dark gleam flashing in her eyes, then said softly, "Sister, you must have been terrified. Why are you being so distant with me?" I was just so worried about the prince. Before I could answer, Gu Tingyuan's weak yet anxious voice called out from inside the tent. "Yener?" Lanyang's eyes lit up. She shot me a quick glance, one that held a barely perceptible hint of defiance, and then she lifted her skirt and ran into the tent. I leaned against a wooden post outside the tent, in no hurry to go inside. Before long, Gu Tingyuan's deep, soothing voice drifted out from within. Even through the curtain, I could picture his expression, even as the poison took hold and tormented him. When facing Lanyao, he would still put on a gentle, graceful facade and use the sweetest words of love to ease her anxiety. That's what he once did to me. Now, it's just someone else doing it. I slowly closed my eyes, my heart completely at peace. In my past life, I had felt as if my heart were being torn apart outside that tent. In this life, however, I found it nothing but laughable. A moment later, the curtain parted, and Gu Tingyuan sat up, supported by two guards. Though his face was pale, his dark eyes still held a scrutinizing gaze as he looked at me. "Lanyao, come in." I parted the curtain and walked in slowly. The air inside the tent was stuffy. He was leaning against a soft pillow, the arrow wound on his chest heavily bandaged. Lanyao was carefully helping him drink water. When she saw me come in, she shrugged her shoulders, looking very timid. "Your Highness." I curtsied, ensuring my manners were impeccable. "Why did you dodge that arrow just now?" Although Gu Tingyuan's voice was weak, the oppressive aura of a superior figure still weighed heavily upon me. He stared at me, as if trying to find a hint of remorse in my expression, or perhaps an explanation for my failure to come to the rescue just now. I looked up and met his gaze, my expression calm. "Your Highness is joking." At that moment, arrows were flying everywhere, and the horses were spooked. If I hadn't moved out of the way, I'm afraid both Your Highness and I would have fallen from our horses, and the consequences would have been unimaginable. Your Highness is of royal blood, while I am merely a lowly court lady. I can barely even protect myself. Gu Tingyuan furrowed his brow, clearly dissatisfied with this answer. "As far as I recall, you've always been an excellent writer and have never made a mistake. People aren't plants or trees. Everyone makes mistakes from time to time." I spoke calmly, paused for a moment, and then added, "As for Sister Lu, Seeing her show such filial piety before the prince at a time like this must surely bring him great comfort. In a nutshell, a little effort goes a long way. Helan Yan's hand holding the cup trembled slightly, and Gu Tingyuan's expression darkened. I said no more and turned to the imperial physician standing nearby. Doctor, will this poison cause any lasting damage to the prince? After all, he still needs to return to the capital to report. If his journey is delayed, it will be difficult to explain to my father. At the mention of my father, General Helan, Gu Tingyuan's expression shifted slightly. His position was not yet secure, and he truly needed the Helan family's support. He waved his hand, signaling the guards to take Helan Yan away, leaving only him and me in the tent. Yaoer, are you still upset? He suddenly asked in a low voice, trying to win me over with his usual sweet talk. I know you're feeling wronged because I neglected you a while back. You're the legitimate daughter of the Helan family and the future princess consort of the Prince of Jing. I've always been fully aware of that. I looked at him, a hint of mockery flickering in the corners of my eyes and brows. This man is truly arrogant to the extreme, thinking that all it would take is a little sweet talk for me to act just as I did in my past life, that even after he'd humiliated me in every possible way, I'd still rush headlong into the flames like a moth at his slightest beckoning. Your Highness, you're worrying needlessly. I've been thinking about calling off the engagement these past few days. Since you've set your heart on someone else, I, Lanyao, am not the type to cling on relentlessly. Gu Tingyuan felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. He sat up abruptly, which tugged at his wound, causing him to gasp in pain. What did you say? How dare you even mention breaking off the engagement? The prince and Yenner are now deeply in love. If I were to forcefully cling to this position, wouldn't I just invite ridicule? I said calmly. Rather than put the prince in a difficult position, it's better to let them be happy. He stared at me, his eyes clouded with a darkness I'd never seen before. He might be able to control people's hearts, but he couldn't control someone who had long since seen through his true nature and given up on him completely. He never expected that the kite string he'd been clutching so tightly in his hand would actually snap. I turned and walked away, refusing to look back at his face, which was a mixture of shock and anger. Outside the tent, the night breeze was cool. I looked up at the lone moon and took a deep breath. With those words just now, I had shattered the shackles of my past life with my own hands. By the time they returned to Helan Prefecture, it was already late at night. As soon as I stepped into the main hall, a heavy scent of sandalwood hit me. Lady Helan sat at the head of the table, rapidly twirling a string of rosewood prayer beads in her hand, which clacked softly against one another. Helan Yan's biological mother, my stepmother, stood to one side with her head bowed, a faint, cold smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Get down on your knees, the old lady said coldly, without even looking up. I stood in the center of the hall, my back straight as a rod, with not the slightest intention of kneeling. I simply looked at her quietly, my tone calm. Grandmother, I do not know what wrong I have committed to deserve punishment at this late hour. The old lady slammed her hand down on the table so hard that the teacups clattered. What wrong have you committed? Gu Tingyuan was attacked at the hunting grounds, and his fate remains unknown. As his fiancé, not only did you fail to protect him, but you stood by and watched coldly, and even had the audacity to ask to call off the engagement? Do you want to bring shame upon the entire Helan manor because of you alone? After hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Such is the Helan family, glitzy and glamorous on the outside, but rotten to the core on the inside. In my previous life, in their quest to curry favor with the Prince of Jing, they forced me to take the blame for him and forced me to swallow my pride and endure humiliation. Yet in the end, all I received in return was the Prince of Jing's suspicion and ostracism toward the Helan household. That's a rather strange thing for grandmother to say. I took a step forward, looked straight into my stepmother's meticulously made-up face, and said slowly, the Prince of Jing was the victim of an assassination attempt. The commander of the Imperial Guards and the Ministry of Justice will investigate that on their own. As a woman confined to the inner chambers, am I supposed to shield him from every threat in the world? As for calling off the engagement, isn't it common knowledge throughout the capital that the Prince of Jing is now deeply in love with my younger sister? If I were to stubbornly cling to the title of princess consort, that would be the true disgrace to the Helan family. Upon hearing this, the stepmother's expression changed abruptly. She hurriedly turned to the matriarch and said anxiously, "Matriarch, just look, this child has become so sharp-tongued. If she were to ruin the relationship between Prince Jing and our household, how would Yenner ever manage in the future?" "Shut up," the old lady snapped in a deep voice, her gaze fixed on me like that of a hawk. "Whether you like it or not, you cannot back out of this marriage arranged by the Prince of Jing's household. A daughter of the Helan family, even if she were a piece of dead wood, must be nailed down in the prince's household." I sneered inwardly. What they feared wasn't that I would call off the engagement, but that the Prince of Jing would take his anger out on the Helan family as a result, thereby cutting off their shortcut to getting Helan Yen into the prince's household. "Since grandmother places such importance on this marriage," I said in a calm, measured tone as I pulled an account book from my sleeve and gently placed it on the table, "there are some matters I should clarify as well. Here are the household expenditure records for the past 3 years. The fabrics used for my younger sister's daily garments and headdresses are all tribute-grade materials, and the silver spend has long exceeded the standard allowance for a legitimate daughter by more than 3 times. Not only that, but several of our family's estates have been operating at a loss year after year, yet the accounts are kept so flawlessly that not a single flaw can be found." The stepmother's face turned pale in an instant. She glanced sharply at the ledger, her eyes filled with panic. I continued, "I'll take responsibility for the marriage arrangements at the prince's residence. But as for this shortfall in the accounts, if His Highness the Prince of Jing were to learn that the Helan family can't even manage their own internal affairs properly, and is even suspected of embezzlement, would he still agree to marry my sister?" The room was eerily quiet. The old lady's gaze toward her stepmother shifted from anger to suspicion. Though she was biased, she valued the Helan family's power and status even more. "Are you threatening me?" The old lady's hand, which had been turning her prayer beads, froze, and her voice trembled slightly. "I wouldn't dare. Grandfather, I just think that if we're going to marry into a prominent family, the household's finances had better be in order." I leaned forward slightly, my tone subtle yet sharp. "I've already made a copy of these ledgers. If the household is still haggling over my marriage tomorrow, then I'm afraid grandfather will have no choice but to take a closer look at these ledgers in the imperial court." My stepmother lunged forward to snatch the ledger, but I dodged to the side. She was shaking with rage as she pointed at me and shouted, "You jinx! Do you really think the Prince of Jing would still listen to you now? Whether he listens or not is his own business." I turned and walked toward the door. Just before stepping outside, I looked back at the 2 women, who were already flustered, and said calmly, "Grandmother, instead of wasting your energy trying to force me, you'd be better off investigating where all the silver in these accounts has gone. After all, compared to a worthless Lanyao, the Prince of Jing seems to value the Helan family's spotless reputation far more." I stepped out of the main hall, and the night breeze swept past me, dispelling the chill from my hair. I knew this was a risky move, but I had to keep the upper hand. Lady Helan was an extremely selfish woman. To protect her family's reputation, she would never dare to force the issue at this moment, much less publicize the marriage at such a critical juncture. I could faintly hear the sound of an argument coming from the main hall behind me, an outcome I had fully expected. If Helan Yen wanted to enter the prince's mansion, it would first depend on whether her guilty mother could make up for this massive financial shortfall. As for Gu Tingyuan, since he's so taken with Helan Yan's gentleness and innocence, let these 2 lovers wear away what little love they have left amidst this chaotic family feud. I walked back to my courtyard with determined strides. The timid and submissive Helan Yao of my past life was dead. Now, I would not only reclaim the dignity that was rightfully mine, but I would also send each and every one of those who had once trampled on me into the abyss they had paved with their own hands. This is just the beginning. The capital, the Prince of Jing's mansion. Gu Tingyuan sat in a carved rosewood chair. Though the wound on his left shoulder had scabbed over, it still throbbed faintly on overcast or rainy days. He stared at the confidential report on the desk regarding the financial irregularities at the Helan Manor, his brow deeply furrowed. He had originally thought that Helan Yao's coldness at the hunting grounds was merely a tactic to keep him at arm's length. But as news of his serious injury spread, Not only did the Helan manor fail to offer even the slightest concern, but it had instead descended into internal strife. Your Highness, a message has come from the Helan family. The matriarch is ill, and they say they are overwhelmed with household matters and currently have no time to attend to the details of the wedding date, the guard reported in a low voice. Gu Tingyuan snorted coldly, crumpled the confidential report into a ball, and casually tossed it into the incense burner. The flames instantly licked at the paper, reducing it to ashes. It wasn't that he didn't understand Helan Yao's intentions. She was using this method to sever their ties and force him to make a choice. Just then, the curtain parted, and Helan Yen walked in wearing a simple moon-white gown, holding a bowl of rich ginseng soup in her hands. Her movements were gentle, yet a hint of worry lingered between her brows. Your Highness, are you worrying about court affairs again? My elder sister has been neglected in the mansion of late. If she has suffered any injustice because of me, Yen'er would feel truly guilty. Gu Tingyuan looked up at Helan Yen. In his previous life, he had found her thoughtfulness so rare and precious. But now, looking into her eyes, which always seemed to hold a hint of calculation, he felt, for some reason, a tinge of weariness. Helan Yao's icy demeanor and sharp tongue, on the other hand, stirred in him a long-forgotten desire to conquer. This has nothing to do with you, Gu Tingyuan said, taking the ginseng soup, though his tone was somewhat impatient. It's Helan Yao who's changed. Just then, the emperor's eunuch arrived in a hurry bearing an imperial decree. The imperial decree noted that although the incident involving the assassination attempt on Prince Jing had been resolved, the assassin's motive remained unclear. In order to appease all parties and to allay criticism within the court regarding Prince Jing's lack of moral integrity, a marriage was specially arranged between Prince Jing and the Helan family. However, the decree did not specify who would become his principal consort, stating only that a daughter of the Helan family was to be chosen for the wedding on a date to be determined. Behind this imperial edict lay the power struggle among various factions within the imperial court, as well as a strategic move by the emperor. Gu Tingyuan clutched the imperial decree, his expression somber. He looked at Helan Yen and saw a flash of unconcealed elation in her eyes. That elation stung Gu Tingyuan. Your Highness, since His Majesty didn't name anyone specifically, then as for my sister, Helan Yen began tentatively. Be quiet. Gu Tingyuan tossed the imperial decree onto the table and fell deep in thought. He had originally intended to use Helan Yao's status as the legitimate daughter to consolidate his power. But after the incident at the hunting grounds, he realized that Helan Yao was no longer the woman who would obey his every command. The next day, the Prince of Jing's mansion hosted a banquet, ostensibly to celebrate his recovery. I arrived as scheduled. At the banquet, Gu Tingyuan sat in the seat of honor, his gaze constantly shifting between me and Helan Yen. Helan Yen had deliberately dressed to look delicate and pitiful today, frequently toasting Gu Tingyuan. Her demeanor was that of a little white rabbit who had suffered a tremendous injustice. Gu Tingyuan suddenly set down his wine cup and addressed the guests at the banquet in a loud voice. The emperor has bestowed this marriage upon me, and I am deeply grateful for His Majesty's grace. The Helan general's household has raised their daughter well. Helan Yao is dignified and virtuous, and she is indeed worthy of the title of princess consort. However, he paused deliberately, his gaze sweeping toward me. The second young lady of the Helan family, Helan Yen, and I are also deeply in love, and she spared no effort in tending to my wounds at the hunting grounds. I do not wish to let this lovely lady down. Therefore, today I take the liberty of requesting the emperor's permission to marry Helan Yen as a secondary consort. As soon as those words were spoken, the entire room erupted in an uproar. The members of the Helan family's faces alternated between pale and ashen. Although Helan Yen had become a secondary consort, asking to marry her on the grounds of mutual affection in front of so many distinguished families was undoubtedly a slap in the face to General Helan's household and a humiliation to me, the principal consort. As I sat at the table watching this unfold, I didn't feel the slightest bit of anger. On the contrary, I gently set down the jade chopsticks in my hand and let a subtle, regretful smile cross my face. Your Highness, you are mistaken, I said as I slowly rose to my feet, my clear voice ringing out distinctly in the silent hall. Since your highness and my younger sister are so well suited, and since she has already been referred to as the fair lady in the emperor's presence, Lanyao truly does not feel worthy of the position of principal consort. Yaoer, what do you mean by this? Gu Tingyuan narrowed his eyes, a chill spreading through the air. Your highness, love cannot be forced. I walked into the hall, bowed slightly to Gu Tingyuan with an open and honest expression. Since your highness cares so deeply for my younger sister, I, Lanyao, hereby request, in front of everyone here today, that you submit a petition on my behalf to the emperor, asking that Lanyao be named the principal consort instead. As for me, I still have the Helan family's ancestral estates to manage, so from now on, I will no longer be entangled in the affairs of the prince's mansion. These words were like a boulder thrown into a calm lake, sending shockwaves rippling across the water. A flash of wild joy crossed Lanyang's eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by unease. She knew that without the support of the general's mansion behind Lanyao, Gu Tingyuan's influence in the court would be severely diminished, and the prince might not dare to actually follow her instructions. Gu Tingyuan stared at me intently. The frustration of being rebuffed nearly caused him to lose his composure. He had originally intended to humiliate me by asking for a concubine, forcing me to compromise, but he never expected that I would actually take the opportunity to step down, willingly relinquishing the position of principal consort, and in doing so, pushing him into a situation where the entire realm would condemn him for abandoning his legitimate daughter for a concubine's daughter. Are you really going to back out? Gu Tingyuan lowered his voice, a final hint of threat lingering in his tone. Since the prince has asked for my sister's hand in marriage, it is clearly a match made in heaven. Why should I be the one to play the villain? I smiled faintly and turned to address the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, the prince's love today runs as deep as the sea, and I am not the sort to be ungrateful. I implore the prince to submit his petition to the emperor at the earliest opportunity, so that this lovely couple may be united. No sooner had I finished speaking than Gu Tingyuan's expression turned as grim as could be. I had completely dismantled his plan, leaving him in a no-win situation. I lifted my foot and stepped out of the banquet hall, my stride light. That oppressive air of intrigue had finally dissipated somewhat. If Lanyao wanted to enter the prince's mansion, then let her. But once she crossed the threshold, whether she could stay alive and whether she could win over Gu Tingyuan's utterly cold and callous heart would depend entirely on her own fate. With the controversy over the arranged marriage at the Prince Jing's mansion still raging, all eyes in the capital were on the Helan mansion. I returned to my private quarters, but I did not let my guard down in the slightest despite the verbal sparring at the banquet. I knew that although I had backed Gu Tingyuan into a corner, he would never willingly relinquish his military authority over the general's mansion. Not only would he not petition the emperor to call off my marriage, but he would instead use my status as a secondary consort to bind the general's mansion completely to his cause. In that case, I'll have to find a safer path for myself. That night, under a moonlit sky as clear as washed silk, I appeared at a private residence on the outskirts of the city, dressed in a plain brocade robe and wearing a veiled cap. The room was brightly lit, and a man clad in light black iron armor sat deep in thought, gazing at a map. He was General Fu Changqing, the general who defends the nation. In his previous life, while garrisoning the border, he had missed the upheaval in the capital. By the time he returned, I had already died in the inner quarters of Prince Jing's mansion. He had once offered wine in tribute at that solitary grave, yet he had never confided a single word of his true feelings to anyone. Hearing the door creak open, he spun around abruptly, his long sword half drawn from its sheath, its cold gleam piercing the air. It's me. I lifted my hood, revealing my cool, composed face. A hint of surprise flashed across Fu Changqing's eyes, but he immediately sheathed his sword and bowed. Miss Helan, you've come to visit so late at night. May I ask what brings you here? Without beating around the bush, I placed a dossier directly on his desk. These are the secret letters exchanged recently between Prince Jing and the Western frontier, as well as a list of his trusted confidants he has planted within the military. Fu Changqing's pupils contracted slightly. He was no fool. With just a glance, he knew the value of this intelligence. In the hands of anyone else, these documents might have been nothing more than scrap paper. But in the hands of a general like him, who commanded a powerful army yet was constantly viewed with suspicion by the imperial court, they were a blade sharp enough to bring down the Prince of Jing. "Why are you helping me, young lady?" He stared into my eyes, his tone brimming with suspicion. "Because I need an ally," I said calmly. "The Prince of Jing has asked for my hand in marriage, and the Helan clan is wavering. If I want to extricate myself from this absurd arranged marriage, I must have someone who can stand up to him." Fu Changqing remained silent for a long time. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt as if a massive boulder were pressing down on them. Perhaps he was weighing the pros and cons of this deal. "Everyone has long had their eyes on the prince's military power," he said. "If I were to take action against him, I would be declaring war on the imperial court. Miss, have you considered the cost of that? All the general needs to do is ask His Majesty for permission to remove me from this list of arranged marriages," I said, straightening my back and speaking with resolve. "In exchange, should any trouble arise at the Prince of Jing's residence in the future, Lanyao, will never reveal a single word about the military supplies hidden in the general's residence." Fu Changqing's expression changed completely. That shipment of military supplies was his greatest weakness. If it were exposed, the confiscation of his property and the extermination of his clan would be imminent. He never imagined that a woman who spent her days confined to her inner chambers could have such a thorough understanding of his secret dealings. "Who are you, exactly?" He lowered his voice. The astonishment of being completely seen through made the look in his eyes as he gazed at me grow complex. I didn't answer. I simply placed the intelligence report gently beside his hand. "That's not important. What matters is whether the general wants to play it safe amid this chaos, or watch as those people gradually erode your legacy." He finally reached out and tucked the stack of intelligence reports away. That faint sound was the most pleasant sound I'd heard all evening. I knew the deal was done. Early the next morning, in the imperial court, a sudden turn of events unfolded. Fu Changqing publicly accused Gu Tingyuan before the emperor of secretly hoarding armor and colluding with foreign enemies. This move shocked the entire court, and the emperor, enraged, immediately ordered a thorough investigation of the Prince of Jing's residence. At the same time, Fu Changqing petitioned the emperor to annul the imperial marriage on the grounds that the daughter of General Helan should not be married to a minister who has fallen into disfavor, and proposed sending me to the Helan ancestral home in Jiangnan to reflect on my mistakes in seclusion, a move intended, in fact, to protect me. I was under house arrest at a villa on the outskirts of Beijing, with layered distant mountains visible outside my window. A few days later, before Gu Tingyuan was stripped of his power and placed under house arrest, he had once sneaked into my courtyard through a secret passage. His face, which had always worn an air of arrogance, was now etched with exhaustion and resentment. He clutched the window frame so tightly that blood seeped from his knuckles. "It's you," he said through gritted teeth, each word seeming to be squeezed out from between his teeth. "You orchestrated all of this." I set down the teacup I was holding and watched him through the window screen. At that moment, I felt a surprising sense of calm. "Your Highness is overthinking this," I said in a subtle tone, laced with a despairing indifference. "You chose this path yourself. You're drawn to Helan Yan's vulnerability, yet you can't bear to part with the power and influence I represent. How could there possibly be such a perfect solution in this world? If it weren't for you, Yenner would have." "Helan Yan?" I interrupted him and chuckled softly. "Right now, she's busy distancing herself from you and selling off your estate." "Your Highness, do you really think she loves you, the Prince of Jing? What she loves is nothing more than that position that brings her endless glory." Gu Tingyuan was struck as if by lightning. He staggered back a step, and the madness in his eyes gradually gave way to despair. "Yower, if only I had." "There are no ifs," I said, standing up and turning toward the inner chambers, my back a picture of resolve. "Your Highness had better focus on the upcoming interrogation. From this day forward, these high walls of the prince's mansion have nothing more to do with me." Lanyao. He stood there, like a shattered stone statue. I knew that even if he wanted to make amends now, it was too late. From the moment I decided I would no longer take that arrow for him, our destinies had already taken completely different paths. The raid on the Prince of Jing's mansion took place sooner than expected. The emperor's fury stemmed not only from those secret letters, but also from the fact that Gu Tingyuan, blinded by his lust for power, had long since lost all sense of propriety. In the space of just half a month, the once vibrant Prince of Jing became a prisoner, and the entire Helan mansion's illicit activities were exposed as a result. I sat beneath the bamboo window of the annex, fingering a string of prayer beads, while news of the Helan Manor's complete downfall reached me from outside. The Lady Helan had been placed under house arrest for failing to manage the household properly, and my stepmother was caught red-handed by the authorities while selling off the manor's possessions to flee the country. She was subsequently sent to prison. "Miss, this news has just come in," the maid said softly as she walked in, handing me a letter. "The woman from the Prince of Jing's mansion has just been divorced in the middle of the bustling marketplace." I unfolded the letter, which had been sent by Fu Changqing through a messenger. Less than half a month after Helan Yan entered the Prince of Jing's mansion, just as the estate was being confiscated, she actually attempted to steal the last of the valuables from the Prince of Jing's treasury in order to escape. Although Gu Tingyuan was behind bars, his influence still held sway. Upon discovering Helan Yan's true nature, he personally wrote a letter of divorce in that cold prison cell and cast her out onto the filthiest streets. I wasn't surprised. In her past life, the only reason Helan Yan was able to emerge unscathed from that power struggle was because of Gu Tingyuan's boundless, unconditional favoritism. Now that she no longer has that man to shield her from the storms, her feigned vulnerability will only become her most fatal weakness in the face of real survival pressures. "Let's go take a look." I stood up and smoothed out my plain, long dress. The long street behind the annex was teeming with people. Standing inside the carriage, I watched Helan Yan from behind the curtain. Her clothes were in tatters, her hair disheveled, and her face, which had once always worn a mask of feigned innocence, was now streaked with mud and tears. The people around her were pointing and whispering. She tried to defend herself, but was shoved aside by an officer. "Helan Yao! It's you! It has to be you!" Helan Yan suddenly seemed to have spotted a lifeline and lunged toward my carriage like a madwoman. The guard drew his sword in an instant, and she was pinned firmly to the ground. "You wretch! You're the one who plotted to frame the prince, you're the one who ruined my life of luxury and privilege," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her eyes brimming with venom. "I was supposed to marry into the prince's household and become the most honored princess consort, but it's all your fault." I pulled back the curtain and looked down at her from above. At that moment, she bore not a shred of resemblance to the woman from her past life who had been showered with endless affection. She was nothing more than a fool whose eyes had been blinded by power and who ultimately reaped what she had sown. "Yanner, you're wrong," I said in a flat tone, even with a hint of pity. "You've never truly understood Gu Tingyuan. What you thought was love was nothing more than a pastime for him after weighing the pros and cons. And the so-called glory you speak of is nothing more than a tower built on sand. When the tide comes in, nothing will remain." Helan Yan stared at me, her gaze gradually shifting from venomous hatred to despair. She tried to say something, but the constable roughly gagged her and dragged her off toward the road to exile. For the rest of her life, she would never have another chance to turn things around. By the time I returned to the annex, it was well into the night. Fu Changqing was waiting for me in the courtyard. He had changed into casual clothes, shedding his usual stern demeanor. "Everything has been taken care of," he said, looking at me with a rare sense of gravity. "All those former officials in the court who had colluded with Gu Tingyuan have also been purged. You can now move on from the shadow of that betrothal." I looked at him, the man who had once kept vigil at my grave in my past life. Now he stood before me, his gaze piercing, radiating a resolve I had never seen in him before. "General, you're not doing all this just for that agreement, are you?" I asked subtly. Fu Changqing paused for a moment. The moonlight cast upon his chiseled features made him appear exceptionally gentle. "Helan Yao. Here in the capital, I don't believe in coincidences. If you hadn't foreseen the future, how could you have handled those ledgers and secret letters with such precision? I didn't just save the Helan Manor, I also saved a woman who dared to defy fate." My heart skipped a beat. He was frighteningly perceptive. Even though I had never mentioned my past life, he had still sensed the change in me. "General," I said, averting my gaze from him and looking instead at the lights in the distance. Most things in this world are a cycle of cause and effect. I used to live in the shadow of others, but from now on, I only want to live for myself. That's enough, Fu Changqing said softly. As long as it's what you want, I'll shield you from the winds of the capital. That night, I slept soundly. I had finally bid a complete farewell to that Lanyao who had thrown herself into the flames like a moth for the sake of her lover. In this game of political intrigue and revenge, I not only regained my dignity but also reclaimed control of my own destiny. Those who had once trampled on me ultimately could not escape the judgment of fate, and I, at last, welcomed my own dawn. Every step of the way has been like walking on thin ice. But as I gaze at the full moon outside the window, I know deep down that this is the boundless horizon I've earned for myself. Spring has been particularly slow to arrive in the capital. Ever since that cataclysmic event, the Helan Manor has been like a dilapidated building with its main beam severed. The old lady has been bedridden, overcome by a mixture of fear and shock, while I moved back from the annex to the old residence at Helan Manor. I did not do this to save the family, but to reclaim my mother's dowry and to thoroughly root out the remnants of those who had aided and abetted the tyrant. On that day, the sunlight was just right, and I sat upright in the main hall, fingering an official seal. The emperor had bestowed it upon me specifically to commend me for the crucial intelligence I provided during the suppression of Prince Jing's rebellion. My relatives from the Helan clan knelt below the dais, each of them silent as mice. They had once regarded me as a cast-off, yet now their very survival depended on my favor. Starting today, I will take full control of all the estates and shops owned by the Helan family, I said in a calm, measured tone that carried an air of unyielding authority. The old lady is advanced in years. She should spend the rest of her days living out her natural life in peace at Jingxin Courtyard. The hall fell deathly silent. No one dared to question me anymore. After all, I now had the general of the realm, who held military power and was a meritorious official whom even the emperor treated with deference, standing behind me. Sister, came a timid voice from behind the screen. It was my half-brother, Keelan Zhe. He had once taken advantage of our father's favoritism to make my life miserable time and again, but now that I was in power, his eyes were filled with fear and a desperate desire to curry favor. Father, he's in the countryside and misses home terribly. I looked up at him. Those eyes, once snobbish and harsh, had long since lost their former arrogance. I ignored his pleasantries and simply said indifferently, "Let him stay in the countryside. He can't handle the waters of the capital." I got up and walked out, without casting another glance at the prison that had held me captive for the first half of my life. As I stepped out of the gates of Helan Prefecture, Fu Changqing's carriage was already waiting by the roadside. Dressed in a navy blue brocade robe, he looked both heroic and reserved. When he saw me come out, he stepped down from the carriage and naturally took the brocade box from my hands. "Is everything taken care of?" he asked gently. "I guess so," I said with a smile. "I've collected everything that was owed to me, one by one." The carriage moved slowly through the bustling streets of the capital. Outside the window, memories of the past flashed by like a revolving lantern. The figure struck by a hidden arrow in the hunting grounds, the man who made hollow promises in the imperial physician's tent, and Helan Yan, wailing and pleading for help in the crowded marketplace. They were the source of my suffering in my past life. But now, everything has been settled. I've heard that His Majesty intends to hold a special imperial examination next month to encourage women to participate in and deliberate on state affairs. Fu Changqing looked at me, a nearly intense gleam in his eyes. "With your wisdom and strategic acumen, there is certainly a place for you in the imperial court." I looked at him, the man who had walked side by side with me all this time. He understood my reluctance to accept defeat, and he understood my ambition. What I seek is not some high position. I simply want the world to see that women are not bound to depend on anyone, nor are they anyone's vassals. My tone was calm, yet my words rang out with conviction. Upon hearing this, the corners of his eyes lifted slightly, revealing a smile that was extremely rare. "As long as it's what you want, there's room for it in this world." I said nothing more, leaning back on the soft couch and watching the scenery flash by outside the window. In my past life, I thought love was redemption, but in the end, It left me with nothing but scars and shame. In this life, I've come to realize that only when I'm strong enough can I take control of my own destiny, and no longer have to shield anyone else from that deadly poisoned arrow. As the carriage approached the city gate, I pulled back the curtain and glanced back at the imperial city. The afterglow of the setting sun bathed the glazed tiles, reflecting a dazzling golden light. That light fell into my eyes, clear and piercingly cold. Without Gu Tingyuan, without He Lan Yen, and free from the heavy shackles of the He Lan family, the rest of my life is finally my own. I have played my final move in this turbulent era. From now on, my days will be filled with radiant glory. I took a deep breath, turned to Fu Chengqing, and said, "Let's go. We'll walk the rest of the way on our own." The coachman cracked his long whip, its sharp crack splitting the sky. The carriage rolled out onto the highway beyond the city walls, heading toward the rising dawn and the golden age that awaited me. As for the pain and hatred of my past life, they had long since been reduced to a cloud of dust by the jostling of the journey, vanishing into the long river of history. I, Lanyao, have lived this life with integrity and dignity. That's the end of the story. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. Thank you.